Hello there, gentle adventurers. Tonight, we follow Caroline Forbes, the vampire who found her humanity not in the life she was given, but in the immortality that took it. The girl who spent 17 years standing in the wings of a story that was always quietly, irreversibly hers. She is the one who was handed darkness and built cathedrals from it, who was told she was not enough, and spent eternity becoming everything. So, before we begin, if these stories bring you comfort and you feel moved to help this channel grow, a subscription would mean more than you know. Now, close your eyes and let Caroline Forbes show you what it looks like when the girl everyone underestimated becomes the last one standing. Mystic Falls, Virginia was the kind of small town that wore its history, the way certain people wear expensive clothes, not simply as covering, but as identity, as statement, as carefully maintained evidence of who they were and where they came from and why that origin mattered more than anything that might come after. The town sat in the Blue Ridge foothills, with the particular quiet authority of a place that had always known what it was. Its streets lined with colonial architecture and magnolia trees that bloomed every spring with the reliable extravagance of things that had been blooming in the same spot for generations. Its social calendar structured around events that had been occurring annually for so long that participation felt less like choice and more like inherited obligation passed down through families, the way furniture and silver and carefully maintained resentments tend to pass generation to generation without anyone stopping to ask whether the inheritance was actually worth carrying. The Founders' Day celebrations that marked the town's yearly rhythm were not merely festivals, but rituals of belonging. Moments when the families whose names appeared on the oldest buildings and the oldest gravestones reasserted their claim to a place that was, in some fundamental way, still theirs in ways that newer arrivals could never quite replicate or fully understand, no matter how long they stayed or how thoroughly they tried to assimilate. The founding families carried weight in Mystic Falls that went beyond simple social prestige, their names opening doors and conferring authority that had been accumulating across 2 centuries of careful cultivation. Their children growing up understanding that being a Lockwood or a Salvatore or a Forbes or a Gilbert meant something specific and demanding. That legacy was not simply gift, but expectation, not simply privilege, but responsibility that required active maintenance and visible performance of the values and commitments that had supposedly defined these families across all the years of their distinguished existence. The town's surface charm concealed layers of history that most residents preferred not to examine too carefully. The antique shops and the grill and the high school football games on Friday nights, and the way everyone seemed to know everyone else's business with comfortable intimacy all sitting above supernatural undercurrents that ran beneath ordinary life, like water beneath thin ice, present and dangerous and largely unacknowledged by the people who walked above it every single day. The Founders' Council existed precisely to manage these undercurrents, its membership drawn from the founding families, its purpose the suppression of supernatural threats that the broader population was not meant to know existed, its operation a kind of civic duty that certain people inherited, along with the family name and the family silver, and the family expectation that service to the town came before personal comfort or personal safety. It was into this world of managed tradition and suppressed history and performance of belonging that Caroline Forbes was born. Elizabeth Forbes, the town sheriff, was a woman whose entire identity had organized itself around competence and duty, and the particular kind of strength that comes from never allowing yourself the luxury of uncertainty in a role that required constant projection of absolute authority. She was good at her job with the thoroughness of someone who had decided early that being good at her job was the most reliable way to matter, the most dependable foundation for a sense of self-worth that did not require the unpredictable cooperation of other people's feelings or other people's recognition. She served on the Founders' Council with the same unflinching practicality she brought to everything else. Her knowledge of the town's supernatural history informing her police work in ways she could never explain to her deputies or to the broader public. Her dual role as law enforcement officer and supernatural threat manager, creating a life that was exhausting in its complexity and its secrecy, and its constant requirement that she be stronger and more certain than she actually felt. Liz Forbes loved her daughter with a completeness that was never in question, but her love expressed itself primarily through provision and protection rather than presence, through ensuring that Caroline had everything she needed in material and practical terms, while the emotional vocabulary that might have accompanied that care remained largely unspoken, crowded out by the obligations of a job that never quite ended, and by the deeper difficulty of a woman who had learned to manage rather than to feel, to address rather than to sit with, to solve rather than to simply be present inside an experience without immediately attempting to resolve it. She showed up to every important event, remembered every deadline, ensured that Caroline's life ran smoothly in all the ways that could be organized and provided for, and in the spaces between those reliable demonstrations of care, there was a quietness that Caroline felt acutely, without having the framework to name what was missing, or why its absence registered as loss. William Forbes occupied the outline of father in Caroline's childhood without quite filling it, his absence more defining than his presence in the particular way that certain absences are, the shape of the missing thing more vivid than the memory of what was actually there. He was not cruel, and he was not indifferent, but he was unavailable in the way that people are unavailable when they are managing private conflicts that consume the energy that should flow toward the people who need them. His love for his daughter real but expressed in the limited ways available to someone who was simultaneously hiding from himself and from the world the fundamental truth of who he was. He would eventually come out as gay, and Caroline would process this revelation with the characteristic combination of hurt and fierce loyalty that defined her response to almost every person she loved who disappointed her. The anger real and legitimate, and the love somehow realer still. The two coexisting without clean resolution in the way that love for imperfect parents tends to do across a lifetime of negotiated understanding and imperfect forgiveness. What this childhood produced in the particular alchemy of a loving but emotionally unavailable mother and an absent but not unloving father, and a town that measured worth by legacy and performance and the careful maintenance of appearances, was a girl who understood from very early on that love required earning, that belonging required demonstration, that the way to ensure she would not be overlooked or left behind was to be so competent and so present and so thoroughly indispensable that overlooking her would require deliberate effort rather than simple inattention. Caroline Forbes became, by the time she reached high school, a perfectionist of the highest order, her organizational abilities extraordinary, and her capacity for planning and executing complex social and logistical enterprises exceeding anything that her classmates possessed or particularly valued. Her need to be involved in every committee and every event and every decision that touched her world, driven not by simple ambition, but by the deeper, older need to matter, to be necessary, to have her presence register as something more than incidental background to someone else's more important story. She kept lists, obsessively detailed lists of tasks and goals and social obligations and academic deadlines and event planning timelines that filled notebooks she maintained with the discipline of someone for whom the act of writing things down was itself a form of control. A way of making the manageable concrete and the uncertain slightly less threatening. A daily ritual of imposing order on an existence that felt fundamentally precarious beneath its organized and cheerful surface. The lists were private architecture, invisible to everyone else. The hidden scaffolding that held up the confident, capable girl that Mystic Falls saw when they looked at Caroline Forbes, the evidence that the ease she projected was not natural but constructed, not effortless, but the product of considerable and constant effort, that she was careful never to let anyone observe directly. She was Elena Gilbert's best friend, and this position, while genuine and deeply felt on both sides, carried its own particular weight and its own particular cost in ways that Caroline felt constantly, without ever quite articulating clearly, even to herself, even in the private honesty of the notebooks she filled with her careful lists and her careful plans. Elena was the girl the story was about, the one whose troubles mobilized everyone around her, whose happiness and whose suffering mattered in ways that rippled outward through the entire social world they inhabited, whose particular quality of compelling sadness and genuine goodness drew people to her with the effortless gravity of someone who had never needed to work for attention or belonging, because both had always simply arrived. Caroline loved Elena with the uncomplicated totality of a best friendship that had survived childhood and adolescence, and the particular intensity of small-town teenage life, where every drama is amplified by proximity and shared history, and the love was entirely real and entirely without reservation, and beneath it ran a current of quiet exhaustion and longing that Caroline was too loyal and too self-aware to resent openly, but that colored everything nonetheless. Bonnie Bennett completed their trio with warmth and a groundedness that was different in texture from Caroline's relentless energy, and different again from Elena's magnetic gravity, her quiet strength providing ballast for a friendship that might otherwise have been destabilized by the intensity of the other two. The three of them fitting together in ways that covered each other's weaknesses and amplified each other's strengths with the particular efficiency of people who have known each other long enough that the accommodation has become unconscious, has become simply the natural shape of how they existed together in the world. Caroline loved Bonnie with a fierceness that would only intensify across everything that followed. Their bond built on something more durable than the romantic complications and supernatural catastrophes that would eventually reshape every other relationship in their lives. The cheerleading uniform was not vanity, though people who did not understand Caroline sometimes interpreted it as such, filing it under the category of shallow concerns maintained by shallow people who prioritized appearance over substance. It was armor and achievement simultaneously, the visible evidence of a body she, disciplined and trained and controlled with the same obsessive attention, she brought to everything else she valued, the demonstration that she was capable of mastery in domains that the social world of Mystic Falls High School recognized and rewarded. She was good at cheerleading the way she was good at everything she committed herself to, with total dedication and precise attention to the gap between where she currently was and where she wanted to be. The gap itself functioning as motivation rather than discouragement, because for Caroline, the distance between present performance and ideal performance was always simply the distance that remained to be closed through sufficient effort. Matt Donovan was kind in the uncomplicated way of someone without significant hidden darkness or unresolved contradiction. His goodness, straightforward and genuine, and ultimately insufficient in ways that neither of them could have articulated while they were inside the relationship together. He cared for her and she cared for him, and they were better suited to being friends than to being lovers, though neither yet had the vocabulary or the distance to recognize this clearly. The relationship sitting in the comfortable middle distance between genuine feeling and genuine incompatibility that characterizes so many early attachments, real and tender and quietly wrong, in ways that had only become legible later. Then there was Damon Salvatore, and whatever his presence in her life represented during those months. It was not kindness, and it was not recognition, and it was not any form of the being truly seen that Caroline had spent her entire life organizing and achieving and performing in pursuit of. Damon noticed Caroline the way certain predators notice prey that seems most likely to be manageable, her obvious desire to be seen and valued making her useful to him in ways that had nothing to do with who she actually was as a person. Her accessibility and her emotional need functioning as convenience rather than as qualities he respected or engaged with honestly. He fed on her and compelled her to forget, and returned when convenient with the casual entitlement of someone for whom other people's autonomy was simply not a consideration that merited attention. The compulsion meaning she could not retain full conscious knowledge of what was happening to her. Her understanding of their relationship existing in the gap between what she believed was occurring and what was actually being done to her. The distortion creating a particular kind of shame and confusion that she could feel the edges of without being able to locate its source or address it directly. The Miss Mystic Falls pageant arrived in the spring with its particular combination of tradition and social performance. That was exactly the kind of event Caroline had been preparing for her entire life. Every skill she had developed in the service of being seen and valued and recognized, now assembled for deployment in a competition that the town took seriously in ways that outsiders would have found difficult to understand or justify. She organized and she planned and she prepared with her characteristic total commitment. And beneath the preparation, the supernatural world she did not yet fully understand was accelerating toward a convergence that no amount of planning or list-making or disciplined preparation could have anticipated or managed or survived intact. Catherine Pierce's calculation was precise and without sentiment, as Catherine's calculations always were. Her decision to use Caroline as instrument in the larger game she was playing with the Salvatore brothers, carrying no more personal feeling than one might bring to the selection of a tool from a workbench. The car accident that followed was not accident, and the blood that Catherine ensured entered Caroline's system during the encounter was not mercy, and the girl who arrived at the hospital afterward was not simply injured but standing at the threshold of a transformation that would unmake everything she thought she was and had been and was becoming. She was 17 years old, and she had never once stopped working toward being enough. She did not know yet that she had always already been more than enough, that the question of her sufficiency had never actually been in doubt, that the people who had made her feel otherwise had been wrong in ways that her entire immortal future would spend itself demonstrating beyond any possibility of reasonable dispute. That future was arriving now, and it would cost her everything, and it will give her back something so much greater that the exchange, in retrospect, would seem almost like grace. Catherine Pierce had been playing games with the Salvatore brothers for a century and a half before Caroline Forbes became useful to her. And the particular game she was playing in Mystic Falls in the autumn of that year required pieces she could move and sacrifice without sentiment, required leverage she could apply and withdraw according to the calculations of someone who had survived long enough to understand that people were most valuable when they were interchangeable, when their individual significance could be subordinated entirely to their function within a larger design. Caroline was not chosen because she mattered to Catherine. She was chosen because she mattered to others, because her proximity to Elena and to the Salvatore brothers made her the kind of piece whose movement would create reactions in the players, whose reactions Catherine actually cared about managing. The cruelty of this was not incidental. It was simply the way Catherine operated, the way she had always operated, reducing every person in her orbit to their utility and discarding whatever remained once the utility was exhausted. The car accident delivered Caroline to the hospital in a condition that the attending physicians described in the careful clinical language of people trying to impose order on chaos. The injuries serious enough that her survival through ordinary means was genuinely uncertain, her body having absorbed the kind of trauma that marks the outer boundary between recoverable and not, between the damage that heals and the damage that simply ends things. She lay in that hospital bed in the particular vulnerability of someone who has been reduced by circumstance to pure biology, to the bare fact of a body working to sustain itself, all the elaborate social architecture of her ordinary life. The lists and the plans and the cheerleading and the careful performance of capability, stripped away by the simple, overwhelming priority of survival. Her mother came and sat with the particular helpless efficiency of a woman who was accustomed to being able to address problems and found herself confronting one she could not address, whose love was total and whose power to help was nearly nothing. Catherine's blood was already in her system when she arrived at the hospital, introduced during the encounter with a calculation so precise and so cold that it registered as almost elegant in retrospect, the former Petrova doppelganger, ensuring that whatever happened to Caroline in the aftermath of the accident, whatever choices other people made in response to her condition, the possibility of transformation remained available as an outcome. It was not mercy. Catherine did not traffic in mercy. It was positioning, the establishment of a contingency that might prove useful, the kind of move that a chess player makes not because they are certain they will need it, but because having the option costs nothing, and eliminating it prematurely costs potentially everything. Damon Salvatore came to the hospital in the small hours of the morning when the corridors were quiet and the staff reduced, and the darkness outside the windows made the institution feel more isolated than it actually was. And what he did when he arrived was not complicated, and was not accidental, and was not the product of anything except his own particular combination of cruelty and convenience. The decision made with the casual efficiency of someone for whom the life of a 17-year-old girl who had served her purpose represented primarily an administrative consideration. He had used Caroline throughout the preceding months as distraction and information source and feeding convenience, had compelled her to forget, and had returned when it suited him, and had treated her existence as entirely subsidiary to his own needs and preferences. And the ending he brought to her human life in that hospital room was consistent with everything that had preceded it. One final act in a sustained pattern of treating her as thing rather than person. She died with Catherine's blood in her system, which meant she did not stay dead. The transition period that followed is described in the clinical language of vampire mythology as the time between death and completion of the transition, the window during which a person who has died with vampire blood in their system exists in a suspended state, neither fully human nor yet vampire, capable of completing the change by consuming human blood, or capable of simply remaining dead if no blood is consumed, or if the choice is made not to cross that threshold. It is framed as choice in the abstract, but the reality of waking in that state, disoriented and frightened, and already beginning to feel the overwhelming pull of a thirst that has no human analogue and no human framework for comprehension, makes the language of choice feel somewhat theoretical when measured against the reality of the experience. Caroline woke in the hospital to a world that had been transformed without her consent or preparation. Every sense suddenly amplified beyond anything her human nervous system had been capable of processing. The sounds of the hospital flooding her awareness with crushing intensity, every conversation and every footstep and every mechanical hum of every piece of equipment registering simultaneously with equal and overwhelming clarity. The smells arriving in complex layered waves that carried information her brain was not yet equipped to interpret, but that her new body responded to with unmistakable urgency. She was terrified, and she was disoriented, and she was hungrier than she had ever been in her human life, in ways that had nothing to do with the ordinary hunger she had known before. The thirst announcing itself not as simple need, but as imperative, as the loudest and most insistent thing in a world that had suddenly become almost unbearably loud and insistent in every direction simultaneously. Stefan Salvatore arrived with the particular quality of someone who had done this before, who understood what she was experiencing because he had experienced it himself and had guided others through it, whose calm in the face of her terror was not indifference, but genuine capability. The difference to her with the directness of someone who understood that softening the truth would not make it more manageable, that what she needed was accurate information delivered with sufficient care that she could begin to orient herself within it, rather than simply drown in the disorientation of having no framework for what she had become. He told her about the blood, about what she needed and what it meant and what her options were, and he helped her through the initial feed-in with the patient guidance of someone for whom this was not transaction, but genuine act of care. His reasons rooted in something more than obligation, in genuine compassion for a young woman who had not chosen this and deserved someone who would treat that unchosen nature with respect rather than dismissal. He had not chosen his own transformation either, had been remade without his full understanding or consent by a woman whose agenda had never fully aligned with his well-being, and this shared quality of having been changed by someone else's decision, rather than one's own, created between them a bond of mutual recognition that would form the foundation of a friendship that would prove more durable and more essential than either of them understood in those first terrible hours. The clarity that transformation brought about Damon arrived gradually and then all at once. The compulsion that had clouded her understanding of their relationship dissolving as her human neurological architecture was replaced by something that functioned differently, something that the earlier compelling could not layer itself over in the same way it had operated before. She understood with the horrible completeness of someone seeing a thing plainly for the first time, after having been prevented from seeing it clearly, what had been done to her across those months. The feeding and the compelling and the returning and the treating of her as convenience rather than person, and the rage that accompanied this understanding was enormous and entirely appropriate, and contained within it something that would take years to fully process, but that began here, in this moment of sudden terrible clarity, as the simple knowledge that she had deserved better and had been given something profoundly worse. She was not simply angry at Damon, though she was that with a completeness and a justification that required no qualification or apology. She was angry at having been made to feel, through the mechanism of his compulsion and his casual cruelty, that his treatment of her was something she had somehow invited or deserved, that the diminishment he had practiced on her was the natural consequence of being the kind of girl she was, rather than the natural expression of the kind of person he was. The compulsion had not created her insecurities, but it had exploited them with precision, had found the existing architecture of her self-doubt, and used it as the framework for a fiction that had made her complicit in her own diminishment, without her knowledge or her consent. Stefan helped her through her first days with a consistency that was itself a form of teaching, demonstrating through his own behavior that the existence she had been forced into without consent could be navigated with integrity, that the thirst that announced itself as imperative did not have to be answered in the ways that would cause the most harm, that there was a different way of being vampire than the way Damon practiced, or the way Catherine embodied. He was not performing virtue for her benefit. He was simply living according to a code he had developed across decades of working out how to be what he was without becoming something he could not live with. And the example of that daily living was more useful to Caroline than any explicit instruction could have been. She discovered the compulsion ability with a mixture of fascination and immediate ethical discomfort. Her own experience of having been compelled, providing a framework for understanding what the ability actually meant in practice, what it cost the person on the receiving end, and what it said about the person who used it without sufficient care for those costs. She could make people forget, could redirect their understanding of events they had witnessed, could smooth over the inevitable moments when her supernatural nature threatened to become visible in ways that would create danger for her and for the people she cared about. And she understood the utility of this ability, even as she understood with particular and personal clarity why its casual use was deeply wrong. She would use it when necessary, and she would feel the weight of using it, and she would never entirely stop feeling that weight, which was exactly the appropriate response, and the response that distinguished her understanding of power from Damon's. Catherine Pierce existed at the edges of these early weeks as dark mirror and implicit warning. The vampire Caroline might become, if she chose to allow the terrible circumstances of her transformation to calcify into bitterness and self-preservation. If she decided that having been used and discarded justified using and discarding others in return. If she traded her genuine capacity for love and loyalty for the cold efficiency of someone who had survived by reducing every other person to their function. Catherine was brilliant, and she was ancient, and she was capable of extraordinary things, and she was also profoundly alone in a way that she had stopped experiencing as loss, because she had stopped allowing herself to experience much of anything that required genuine vulnerability or genuine connection. And Caroline looked at her and understood with the clarity of someone who had always known exactly what she did not want to become, that this was not the path she intended to walk. The decision formed not as dramatic declaration but as quiet, settled certainty, the kind of resolution that does not require announcement because it does not require convincing anyone, including oneself. Simply the recognition of a fact about who she was and who she intended to remain, regardless of what had been done to her or what she had become. She was Caroline Forbes. She had always been more capable and more loving and more resilient than the people around her had taken the time to properly recognize. She was going to be a vampire the same way she had been a cheerleader and a student council member and Eleanor Gilbert's best friend, with total commitment and precise attention to the distance between where she currently was and where she intended to be, and she was going to close that distance through whatever combination of discipline and care and stubborn refusal to become something she was not that the situation required. She was terrified. She was grieving the human life that had been taken from her without her consent. She was furious at the people whose decisions had brought her to this place. And she was already beneath all of that, becoming something that neither she nor anyone who had known her before could have predicted with any accuracy. Something that would take years to fully emerge, but that was already present in outline in the way she set her jaw and steadied herself and looked at the impossible thing that had happened to her and decided that, impossible or not, it was now simply what was true. And what was true required management, and management was something she had always been exceptionally good at. The thing that surprised everyone, including Caroline herself, was how good she was at it. Not immediately, not in those first disorienting weeks when the thirst was constant and the sensory overwhelm was relentless, and every ordinary interaction carried the potential for catastrophe if her attention slipped for even a moment, but with a speed and a thoroughness that distinguished her transition from those of most new vampires, and that had everything to do with who she had been before the transformation remade her. The perfectionism that had driven her to maintain every committee and execute every plan and close every gap between current performance and ideal performance turned out to translate with remarkable directness into the kind of sustained disciplined effort that managing a vampire existence required. The same obsessive attention to the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, now applied to the management of bloodlust and sensory control, and the careful maintenance of a human-appearing life that could continue without exposing what she had become to the people who were not yet equipped to know it. Stefan had given her the framework, and she had taken it and built something with it that exceeded the framework itself, developing her own techniques and her own internal practices for managing the thirst that went beyond what he had specifically taught her, finding through trial and careful observation of her own responses the particular combination of vigilance and acceptance that worked for her specifically, that allowed her to exist in proximity to human blood without being controlled by the urgency of her response to it. She hunted with increasing confidence, learned the difference between the thirst that required immediate attention and the thirst that could be managed through practiced mental discipline, developed the capacity to sit in a classroom surrounded by human classmates and maintain perfect composure, while the most difficult aspect of her new existence announced itself constantly at the edges of her awareness, demanding and ignored, and eventually, gradually, more manageable than it had initially seemed possible for it to become. Returning to Mystic Falls High School was surreal in a way that resisted adequate description. The mundane rituals of ordinary teenage life, continuing with complete indifference to the fact that one of the students moving through them had died and been remade into something fundamentally other than what she had been when she last sat in these classrooms and walked these corridors. She sat through history lessons with knowledge she had not yet processed about what history actually contained, took notes in English class with a hand that would never age, navigated the social dynamics of the cafeteria and the hallways and the parking lot with the careful, practiced ease of someone performing normalcy rather than simply inhabiting it, the performance convincing enough that most of her classmates registered nothing different about her, beyond perhaps a new quality of stillness, a new precision in her movements that read as confidence rather than supernatural reorientation. The control she developed became a source of genuine pride in a way that her previous achievements had never quite managed to be. The satisfaction deeper and more personal than anything she had felt about her organizational accomplishments or her cheerleading excellence, because this was not performance for an audience and not achievement in pursuit of external recognition, but mastery accomplished entirely for herself, in service of values she had chosen and maintained without anyone else's awareness or approval. Nobody knew how hard she was working. Nobody could see the constant vigilance that underlay the casual ease of her presence. The invisibility of the effort was, for once, not a source of loneliness, but a source of something approaching quiet pride, the knowledge that she was capable of this tucked privately away, where it could not be diminished by anyone else's assessment or anyone else's failure to notice. Her relationship with Matt Donovan continued through those early months of her transformation, with the particular difficulty of an intimacy that could no longer be fully honest, the kindness and the genuine feeling between them now shadowed by the secret she was keeping and by the compulsion she used on him when proximity to his blood threatened her control in moments she had not adequately anticipated or prepared for. She hated the compulsion with a personal intensity that went beyond abstract ethical objection, hated what it made her in relation to someone who trusted her and cared for her without reservation, hated the way it replicated in miniature the dynamic that Damon had practiced on her, the erasure of someone's accurate perception of their own experience in the service of the person doing the erasing. She used it anyway, because the alternative in those moments was worse, and she carried the guilt of using it with the seriousness it deserved, and she understood that the relationship was living on borrowed time because secrets of this magnitude and this intimacy could not be sustained indefinitely without destroying the foundation they were supposedly protecting. The end of their romantic relationship arrived with the sad inevitability of something that had been approaching for longer than either of them had admitted. The acknowledgement that they loved each other in ways that were real and that were not sufficient, that the person Caroline was becoming existed in a context that Matt's ordinary human life could not fully accommodate. That trying to maintain the relationship was costing them both more than continuing it was giving either of them. It was not dramatic, and it was not hateful, and it left behind a genuine friendship that would prove more durable than the romance had been. Matt Donovan remaining someone Caroline cared about and protected and returned to across everything that followed. The bond between them surviving the end of the relationship in the way that bonds built on actual affection rather than simply mutual need sometimes managed to do. Tyler Lockwood's werewolf curse activated in the particular way that the Lockwood family curse worked, requiring the taking of a life before it would manifest in its full terrible form. The accident that triggered his first transformation arriving with the sudden irreversibility of events that cannot be undone or reframed or organized away, simply absorbed into the permanent record of what had happened and what it meant going forward. Caroline found herself positioned, almost accidentally, as the person who understood what Tyler was going through in ways that no one else in his life currently could. Her own experience of involuntary supernatural transformation, giving her a framework for his terror and his shame, and his desperate need for someone who would neither minimize what had happened to him, nor treat him as threat requiring management, rather than person requiring support. Their friendship built itself on this foundation of mutual comprehension across a boundary of experience that most people could not cross. Tyler coming to Caroline not despite what she was, but because of what she understood. His vulnerability in those first weeks after his transformation, creating space for a genuine connection that the social dynamics of their ordinary high school lives would never have generated between them under normal circumstances. She was patient with him in ways that drew directly on everything Stefan had been patient with her about, the guidance flowing through her now rather than simply toward her. The experience of having been the terrified, disoriented new supernatural creature now informing her capacity to accompany someone else through that same experience with genuine rather than performed empathy. It was, unexpectedly, one of the first moments when she understood what her transformation might be for, what it might give her beyond the obvious costs and complications, the capacity to help someone else in a specific and irreplaceable way that her human self could never have offered. The romantic dimension of what was developing between them emerged gradually from this foundation of genuine friendship and mutual recognition. Neither of them entirely certain at first that what they were feeling was distinct from the deep gratitude and comfort of having found someone who truly understood their situation, then gradually more certain as the distinction between friendship and something more became impossible to maintain without deliberate suppression. Tyler looked at Caroline and saw someone remarkable. Not the girl who existed in Elena's shadow, or the overachiever performing for external validation, but someone actually extraordinary in ways he had not known how to perceive when they were simply classmates navigating the same ordinary social world without the context that might have made her visible to him earlier. She felt in his attention something that was different in texture from what she had felt before. Recognition rather than projection. Someone responding to who she actually was rather than to what she could provide or what role she could fill in their narrative. Klaus Mikkelson's arrival in Mystic Falls with Elijah preceding him changed every calculation and every dynamic in ways that the Cullen family's encounter with the Volturi had changed theirs. The introduction of power so ancient and so comprehensive that it reoriented everyone's understanding of where they actually stood in the supernatural hierarchy. Klaus was the original hybrid, vampire and werewolf, combined through dark magic into something that exceeded either species alone. His 1,000 years of existence having given him patience and cunning, and a capacity for cruelty that was matched only by his genuine aesthetic sensibility and his particular talent for identifying what people most valued and either offering it or threatening it according to his current requirements. His agenda in Mystic Falls was specific and involved Elena as the Petrova doppelganger, whose blood he needed for a ritual that would break the curse binding his werewolf side. And Caroline existed at the edges of this agenda as Elena's friend and as collateral consideration rather than as primary target. The sacrifice ritual required a human a werewolf, and a vampire, and the preparation surrounding it brought violence to people Caroline loved in ways that tested every resource of resilience she had been building since her transformation. Klaus, compelling her father to torture her as demonstration of his power and his willingness to use anyone and anything in the service of his goals, was a specific horror that had dimensions beyond the physical, the psychological complexity of being hurt by her own father, regardless of the mechanism of compulsion, of watching Bill Forbes carry out the actions of someone causing deliberate harm to his child, creating a grief and a confusion that the straightforward anger at Klaus could not entirely contain or resolve. She survived it because she was Caroline Forbes, and surviving impossible things was. It was becoming clear, something she was exceptionally good at. Her fundamental toughness, not the absence of pain, but the persistence through it, the refusal to be broken by things that were genuinely attempting to break her. Her father's arc through these months contained more complexity than simple victimhood. Bill Forbes eventually returning with his own anti-vampire convictions and his own agenda for Caroline's existence. His love for her warring with his moral certainty in ways that produced a particular damage that only parents can inflict. The harm that arrives wrapped in genuine care and therefore cannot be simply categorized as cruelty and discarded. He tried to train her to resist compulsion through methods that caused her pain. His belief that she needed to be capable of operating without supernatural assistance, rooted in something that was not entirely wrong, even as the method was entirely unacceptable. And Caroline endured it and pushed back against it and never stopped loving him, even when loving him was the most difficult thing available to her. His eventual death would cost her in ways that were specifically complicated by how unresolved their relationship remained. The grief shadowed by everything that had never been said and could now never be said. The loss arriving before the repair. She was, by the close of her second year as vampire, genuinely someone different from the girl she had been at 17. Not in the core of her values or the fundamental direction of her caring, but in the confidence and the capability and the self-knowledge that the past 2 years of navigating impossible things had produced. She had mastered the most demanding aspects of her transformation without losing herself in the process. She had built real friendships across the boundary of species. She had been hurt by people she loved and had absorbed the hurt without becoming bitter or closed. She had discovered, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent their entire human life proving themselves to a world that was not quite paying attention, that she was exactly as capable as she had always believed she was, and that this capability was genuinely remarkable rather than simply adequate, genuinely worth something rather than simply functional. The girl who had needed everyone to see her was becoming a woman who knew her own worth regardless of whether the seeing occurred. It was not a small transformation. It was, in many ways, the most significant one. Klaus Michelsen had existed for 1,000 years, and in that time had encountered every variety of human and vampire behavior available to observation, had catalogued weakness and strength and ambition and despair with the comprehensive attention of someone for whom other people were primarily material to be assessed and utilized rather than genuinely engaged with, had built around himself a fortress of power and cruelty and ancient grievance that, functioned as both protection and prison in ways he would not have admitted, and perhaps had stopped being able to perceive clearly after so many centuries of maintaining it. He was not accustomed to being surprised. He was not accustomed to encountering someone who refused to be managed or intimidated or impressed into submission by the simple, overwhelming fact of what he was and what he was capable of doing to anyone who opposed him. He was not accustomed to Caroline Forbes. The moment he genuinely noticed her was not the first moment he saw her, not the early encounters where she existed at the periphery of his agenda as Elena's friend and incidental consideration, but a specific later moment when she spoke to him with a directness and a refusal to perform the fear that his presence was designed to produce, when she looked at someone who had been alive for a millennium and had destroyed entire families without remorse, and said what she actually thought, with the particular fearlessness of someone who had decided that the worst had already happened to her, and that there was therefore less to lose in honesty than in the performance of deference she did not feel. He had expected her to be like everyone else, to shrink or to flatter or to calculate the safest possible response to his attention. And she had done none of these things, and the surprise of this registered in him as something that his 1,000 years had not made him immune to. The simple, genuine interest in encountering something he had not already encountered before. His courtship of Caroline, if the word courtship could be applied to something that contained so many elements of manipulation and possessiveness, and the particular arrogance of someone accustomed to simply taking what he wanted, was also genuinely something else simultaneously. The coexistence of these contradictory qualities being precisely what made it impossible to resolve into simple categories of good or bad or acceptable or monstrous. He brought her a bracelet with the casual certainty of someone who understood the language of beautiful things and knew that offering one was different from simply demonstrating wealth or power, that the selection of something genuinely lovely and the giving of it with attention to the specific person receiving it, rather than simply to the act of giving, was its own kind of statement, a declaration that he had looked at her carefully enough to understand what she might value and had chosen accordingly. She took it and felt the complicated mixture of genuine pleasure at being seen and genuine fury at herself for feeling pleasure at being seen by someone whose actions she could not and would not excuse. The internal conflict immediate and honest and unresolved, because it was the kind of conflict that did not resolve, that simply had to be inhabited. Their conversations revealed dimensions of him that his public presentation was designed to conceal. Not vulnerabilities exactly, but genuine enthusiasms. The aesthetic sensibility that had survived 1,000 years of violence and loss. His experience of the world as someone who had walked through centuries that most people could only read about in history books that compressed the complexity of entire eras into simplified narratives that bore little resemblance to what it had actually felt like to be alive inside them. He described places with the particular detail of someone who had been there when they were different, who carried layered memories of the same geography across centuries of change, who could tell her what Rome had smelled like in a specific century, or what music had sounded like before recording technology flattened its complexity into something reproducible and therefore ordinary. He offered her the world not as metaphor, but as literal possibility, as the actual accumulated experience of someone who had seen it all, and was suggesting she might want to see it too. His invitation carrying within it the implicit argument that she was someone worth taking to beautiful places, someone whose appreciation of beauty would match the beauty itself. The drawing he made of her with the horse was the gesture that complicated everything most thoroughly. The act of artistic attention being different in kind from the bracelet or the descriptions of distant places, requiring him to look at her for long enough and with sufficient care that the result was genuinely her rather than a generic rendering of female beauty, her specific quality captured with the skill of someone who had been practicing for centuries and the attention of someone who found the subject genuinely worth the care. She held it and felt something shift in the architecture of her resistance. Not a collapse, but a recognition that her resistance was costing her something, that maintaining the wall required effort that was beginning to feel different from principled refusal and more like willful blindness to something that was actually happening to her, whether she acknowledged it or not. She did not lower the wall, but she knew it was there in a more conscious way than she had known it before, which is different from not knowing. The McCausland ball was Klaus in his most deliberate mode, the creation of occasion designed to display both his power and his refinement, the gathering of the town's supernatural population in his family's home, transformed for one evening into a setting of genuine elegance, the whole enterprise a demonstration that he was not simply dangerous but cultured, not simply ancient but civilized in ways that the people who feared him tended to forget when they were focused on the fear. He sought Caroline out with a specificity that was visible to everyone paying attention. His interest in her presence at the event not concealed by any pretense that she was one guest among many. His conversation with her carrying the quality of someone who had arranged the entire evening partly as context for this specific exchange. They danced and she felt the physical reality of his attention, the way he moved with the ease of someone who had danced in actual courts across actual centuries, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the experience was not simply something to be endured or managed, but something that registered as genuinely affecting, regardless of her wishes on the subject. She told him what she thought of him with a consistency that never varied according to whether the honesty was convenient or safe, never softened her assessment of his cruelty or his manipulation or the genuine harm he had done and continued to do to people she loved and to people she did not know, who had simply had the misfortune of intersecting with his agenda at the wrong moment. She held him accountable in conversations where no one else would have dared, where his 1,000 years of accumulated power should have made accountability feel absurd. And the accountability landed because she delivered it without performance, without the self-consciousness of someone making a speech, simply as the direct expression of her actual assessment of a situation she was looking at clearly and refusing to misrepresent out of fear or desire. He listened in a way he did not listen to most people, his attention genuine rather than simply strategic, something in her directness reaching past the defenses that centuries of being Klaus Michelsen had constructed and finding something inside them that still recognized being truly addressed, rather than simply managed. Tyler's absence during these months reshaped her emotional landscape in ways that were complicated by the nature of his departure. His sacrifice of his own freedom to Klaus's hybrid curse, made in service of protecting people he loved, the nobility of it real and the cost of it real, and the effect on Caroline of having the relationship she had chosen suddenly removed through no failure of either of them, particularly difficult to process. She had not lost him to something simple like incompatibility or growing apart, had not lost him to a failure of love on either side, but to the intervention of a power that neither of them had been able to prevent or manage. And this specific kind of loss carried its own particular weight, the grief shadowed by the helplessness of having been unable to do anything about it regardless of how thoroughly she organized and planned and tried. Klaus had saved her life once before, his blood the only cure for a werewolf bite that would otherwise have killed her. The intimacy of that act existing in complicated relationship with the fact that his family's creation of hybrids had been the reason the threat existed in the first place. His arrival at the barn where she lay dying had been accompanied by the full weight of his awareness of what he was doing and what he intended it to mean. His healing of her not presented as simple generosity, but as statement of his perception of her value, his blood offered with the implicit communication that she was worth saving, in a way that went beyond her utility to anyone else's agenda. She had felt, in those hours of recovery, the full disorienting complexity of genuine gratitude towards someone whose fundamental nature she could not endorse. The gratitude real, and the moral clarity about him real, and the two things coexisting without resolution. The evening when he appeared at her door, while she managed the chaos of the season's supernatural crises, and spoke to her about small beautiful things, about music and travel and the particular quality of light in specific places at specific times of day and year, represented Klaus at his most deliberately disarming, the calculation present, but so was something beneath the calculation, some genuine impulse toward connection that was not entirely reducible to strategy or manipulation. She stood at the boundary of her own home and felt the weight of everything she knew about him and everything she felt about him, and the unbridgeable distance between those two things. And she was honest with herself about the fact that the distance was not closing in the direction of him becoming someone she could simply dismiss. When Liz Forbes became ill, and Klaus provided the only blood that could address the specific supernatural mechanism threatening her mother's life, Caroline's capacity to maintain simple moral clarity about him was tested at its deepest level. The gratitude for this specific action arriving with the full understanding that it was not uncomplicated, that his willingness to help her mother existed within a larger pattern of behavior that had caused enormous harm to enormous numbers of people, that being kind to Caroline did not balance the ledger against everything else, and that knowing all of this did not make the gratitude less real or less overwhelming in the specific moment of her mother surviving something she might otherwise not have survived. She was furious at the gratitude. The gratitude did not care. She chose Mystic Falls when he ultimately left, chose her people and her commitments and the life she was building over the possibility he represented, and the choice was genuine. rather than simply the default of someone too afraid to leave. The active selection of one kind of life over another with full awareness of what was being set aside. She had looked at what he was offering, the world and the centuries, and the genuine, if complicated, attention of someone who saw her more completely than most people had managed to see her. And she had looked at what she was keeping. And she had kept what she was keeping with the full force of her considerable will and her considerable clarity about her own values. The choice cost her something. She made it anyway. This was who Caroline Forbes was. Someone who knew what things cost and paid the cost and kept choosing according to who she actually was, rather than who she might become under different circumstances. What Klaus represented in her story was not simply romantic complication, but the first genuine encounter with the full range of her own emotional complexity. The first experience of feeling things that could not be organized into clean categories or managed through sufficient planning. The first proof that she was capable of inhabiting contradiction without needing to resolve it immediately into something more comfortable. She was more than the girl who had needed to be seen. She was someone who could be seen completely, the good and the difficult and the contradictory, all of it, and remain standing and keep choosing, and carry everything she felt without being destroyed by the weight of feeling it. Lena Gilbert's transition into vampire happened with the particular cruel irony of something that had been feared and debated and agonized over for years, finally arriving through circumstances that made every previous conversation about it feel inadequate and beside the point. The theoretical discussions about choice and humanity and whether becoming vampire was transformation or destruction, replaced overnight by the simple concrete reality of Eleanor waking in transition and the group having to respond to the actual event rather than the anticipated one. She had died with vampire blood in her system during the confrontation on Wickery Bridge. The same mechanism that had remade Caroline now remaking Elena. And Caroline found herself in the strange position of being the person in the group who understood most directly and most personally what Elena was experiencing in those first devastating hours of sensory overwhelm and thirst, and the terror of having her own responses feel entirely outside her control. She helped with a particular competence of someone who had navigated this specific terrain and retained accurate memory of what had been most useful and what had been most frightening, and what had been most necessary to hear in the early period when everything felt impossible and permanent and beyond any hope of management. She was patient and she was present and she was genuinely useful. And beneath all of that, she was experiencing something more complicated than simple compassion. Something she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge, even if she was careful about where and how she expressed it. Eleanor was transitioning with the full and immediate support of everyone who loved her, with Damon and Stefan both present and focused entirely on her well-being, with the entire group mobilized around her comfort and her survival and her successful navigation of what came next. And Caroline had done this essentially alone, with Stefan's help and the guidance of someone who genuinely cared, but who was not the same as having everyone she had ever loved appear at her bedside and rearrange their priorities around her needs. The sire bond between Elena and Damon emerged as the season's central complication, the supernatural, mechanism by which a vampire who was in love with their maker at the moment of transition could find their behavior shaped by that maker's expressed wishes in ways that were distinct from compulsion, but functionally similar in their overriding of autonomous choice. Caroline's suspicion about the sire bond arrived early and was categorical. Her protective instincts toward Eleanor and her existing understanding of Damon's character combining into a resistance to the narrative that Elena's feelings and choices were entirely her own, that she maintained with a persistence that the people who found her suspicion inconvenient read as jealousy or small-mindedness, rather than as the genuine concern for her best friend that it actually was. She had been compelled by Damon, had experienced directly what it meant to have one's will and perception shaped by his influence without one's knowledge or consent. And she was not willing to simply accept that what was happening with Elena was categorically different without more evidence than his assertion that it was. The question of the cure for vampirism arrived in this context as another dimension of the season's central argument about Elena's choices and their authenticity, the search for something that could restore humanity to those who had lost it, carrying different weight for different members of the group, according to what they believed about whether their supernatural existence was something to be escaped or something to be inhabited. Caroline had answered this question for herself with a clarity that had only deepened with time. The life she had built as vampire and the person she had become through navigating its demands, feeling not like consolation prize for what she had lost, but like genuine rival at something she valued, something she would not trade back for the human life that had been characterized by insecurity and performance, and the constant, exhausting effort of trying to be enough. She would not have taken the cure. The certainty of this answer told her something important about how completely she had made peace with what she was. The Augustine vampire experiments represented a specific category of horror that was different in texture from the supernatural violence she had become somewhat accustomed to navigating. The scientific institutional framework of what Dr. Maxfield and the Whitmore Secret Society were doing, placing it in a tradition of abuse that was older and more coldly deliberate than the impulsive cruelties of most of the supernatural threats she had encountered previously. Being captured and held as experimental subject, being treated as specimen with interesting properties to be studied and documented and exploited, rather than as person with rights and interiority and relationships that extended beyond the laboratory, activated something in Caroline that connected directly to the oldest dimensions of her story, to Mary Alice Brandon in her asylum, and to every person who had ever been institutionalized and studied and managed rather than seen and understood and helped. She did not make this connection explicitly in the moment of her captivity, but it ran beneath her response to it, informing the particular quality of her anger and the particular fierceness of her refusal to be reduced to what her captors wanted her to be. She organized within the captivity because organization was what she did when everything else was removed. Her mind moving through the available information and the possible options with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the difference between surviving impossible situations and not surviving them was often simply the willingness to keep looking for the path out, rather than accepting that no path existed. She assessed Jesse with the careful attention of someone trying to determine what he was and what he knew, and whether he represented threat or potential ally. His status as Augustine vampire, engineered to feed on other vampires rather than on humans, making him genuinely dangerous in ways that required ongoing management, even as his evident confusion and distress made him sympathetic in ways that made pure threat assessment feel insufficient and reductive. Jesse's death arrived in the accumulating ledger of losses that was beginning to characterize Caroline's experience of this period with the weight of something that was individually significant, and also part of a larger pattern that was becoming harder to hold without acknowledging its cumulative effect. She had not loved Jesse with the depth or the duration of her feeling for Tyler, or the complexity of what she had experienced with Klaus, but she had genuinely liked him and had allowed herself to care about his survival and his navigation of his supernatural existence, and what his life might become if given sufficient space and support to develop. And losing him meant losing not just him specifically, but the possibility she had invested in him, the future she had begun constructing in her imagination around his continued existence. Bonnie Bennett's death was in a different category entirely, operating at depths that the other losses of this period could not reach, and that Caroline could not fully process in the immediate aftermath because the full weight of it was distributed across time in a way that made the grief arrive in installments rather than all at once. Bonnie died, and then Bonnie was not entirely gone, existing in a state that defied the clean categories of alive and dead, communicating through a journal that Jeremy could see and others could not, maintaining connection with the living world through a mechanism that was itself a kind of ongoing loss, the presence real enough to prevent the grief of complete absence, but insufficient to provide the actual embodied connection of her friend being alive and present and available in the ways that mattered most. Caroline maintained the pretense that Bonnie was still alive for the broader social world of mystic fools, participated in the performance of normalcy that protected those who were not yet ready to receive the truth, and carried the knowledge of her best friend's death in the hidden interior, where she carried all the things that were too large or too painful to display openly, without losing the functional composure that everyone around her had come to depend on. The pretense cost her in ways that were specific to her particular psychology, her relationship with honesty and her discomfort with performance in contexts where performance felt like a form of harm, the necessary deception sitting uneasily with the part of her that had always believed that people deserved accurate information about the things that most affected their lives. Silas operated in this season as the particular kind of threat that was most difficult for Caroline to counter. His ability to appear as anyone undermining the basic reliability of perception that allowed her to function and plan and navigate with her characteristic purposefulness. She could not see Silas coming, because Silas could look like someone she trusted, could replicate the face and voice of anyone in her world, and use her genuine love for those people as the mechanism for getting close enough to cause harm. The manipulation working precisely because her capacity for love was real, and her trust in the people she loved was genuine, and Silas was willing to exploit both without hesitation or compunction. The experience of being deceived by something wearing a beloved face was a violation of a particular kind, contaminating the safety of connection itself, making the very fact of caring about people into a vulnerability that could be weaponized. The collapse of the other side toward the end of this period brought the accumulated grief of the season to its most catastrophic point, the supernatural dimension where dead vampires and witches and other creatures existed after death, beginning to disintegrate, its structural integrity failing in ways that meant the souls it housed were being lost not simply to death, but to oblivion, to a nothing that was more final and more absolute than ordinary death, because it offered no dimension of continuation in any form. Bonnie's role as anchor meant she was holding the deteriorating other side together through her own body, feeling every supernatural death as physical agony. Her existence in this period a sustained endurance of pain that Caroline could observe without being able to alleviate. The loss of Damon and Bonnie together as the other side finally collapsed, completely arrived as the season's final and most devastating blow. The double absence arriving simultaneously in ways that made the grief impossible to properly apportion. Both losses real, and both losses demanding response in the world that had suddenly contracted significantly around everything that remained. Caroline stood in the aftermath of this collapse with the same quality of toughness that had characterized her response to every previous loss. The grief absorbed rather than denied, the continuation chosen rather than simply defaulted into. The evidence of her fundamental resilience, visible not in any absence of pain, but in the simple fact of still being present, still being Caroline Forbes, still organized and still loving, and still entirely unwilling to allow even this to be the thing that finally broke her. She was still standing. She was always still standing. This was not a small thing. This was, in fact, the most essential thing about her. Whitmore College existed approximately 2 hours from Mystic Falls, in the particular way that certain distances function less as geography and more as intention. The physical separation from the town that had defined every dimension of Caroline's existence, suggesting the possibility of becoming someone whose identity was not entirely organized around the place where she had been born and died and remade into something extraordinary. Someone whose story might develop new chapters set against different backdrops and populated by people who had no prior knowledge of who she had been before she became who she was now. She approached the transition to college with the characteristic totality of her commitment to new phases, researching roommate assignments and campus layouts and course offerings and extracurricular organizations with the same obsessive thoroughness she had brought to every previous organizational challenge in her life, her planning serving its usual dual function of genuine preparation and anxiety management. The lists and the schedules and the carefully annotated maps of the campus creating the working illusion of control over a situation that was, beneath its ordinary collegiate surface, considerably more dangerous and more complicated than standard freshman orientation materials were designed to suggest or accommodate. The dorm room she shared with Elena carried the particular intimacy of people who had known each other across enough years and enough catastrophes that ordinary dormitory proximity felt almost quaint by comparison. two vampires navigating the residential college experience with the dual awareness that they were doing something genuinely normal, and that the institution they had chosen had a secret society conducting experiments on people like them operating somewhere beneath its respectable academic surface. Caroline decorated with the attention to detail that her roommates found either impressive or excessive, depending on their tolerance for comprehensive aesthetic commitment. Her understanding that environments shaped experience, making the curation of their small shared room feel not like frivolity, but like the reasonable exercise of agency over the few variables she could actually control in a situation that contained considerably more uncontrollable variables than she was entirely comfortable acknowledging. She bought matching bedding and organized the shared closet with a system that was logical and labeled, and that Eleanor accepted with the resigned affection of someone who had long since understood that resisting Caroline's organizational impulses cost more energy than simply allowing them to proceed. The attempt to build ordinary college life proceeded with the slightly surreal quality of a performance that both performers understood to be performance, without this understanding making it less genuine or less valued. The normalcy they were constructing real in the ways that mattered, while also being thoroughly penetrated by the supernatural complications that had followed them from Mystic Falls, with the faithful persistence of things that do not recognize or respect the human desire for fresh starts and clean slates, and the possibility of being someone new, somewhere that did not already contain the entire accumulated weight of your history. She went to parties and attended lectures and navigated the social geography of a new institution among people who did not know her history, and the anonymity was both genuine relief and its own specific kind of loneliness. The freedom from being comprehensively known, shadowed by the awareness that being unknown meant that nothing she did here would be witnessed by anyone who understood what it had cost her to become capable of doing it, what she had survived and lost and transformed in order to arrive at this ordinary dormitory hallway carrying a laundry basket on a Tuesday afternoon. She joined organizations because Caroline Forbes joined organizations the way other people breathed, automatically and without particular deliberation. Her instinct toward involvement and contribution, operating independently of any conscious decision about whether involvement was advisable given her current circumstances. She assessed which student groups might benefit from the specific combination of organizational precision and interpersonal attentiveness she offered, identified the gaps in their functioning that her presence could address, and inserted herself with the cheerful confidence of someone who had never seriously entertained the possibility that her contributions might not be welcome. This quality, which some people found exhausting and others found invaluable, and most found some combination of both, was as fundamental to her as her eye color, as unchangeable as the vampire strength she had been carrying for 2 years now, and she had stopped apologizing for it long before she arrived at Whitmore. Dr. Maxfield appeared early in the semester as a figure of surface academic charm, concealing the specific variety of menace that Caroline had learned across years of supernatural navigation to recognize in people whose interest in vampires was extractive rather than simply curious or hostile. His attention to Elena and to the circumstances of various students' disappearances registering in her perception as something requiring sustained monitoring even before she had sufficient concrete information to articulate precisely what was wrong about him. His manner was too calibrated, his knowledge too specific, his comfort around the evidence of supernatural activity too practiced for someone who was supposed to be encountering it as a new phenomenon. And Caroline filed these observations with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that the gap between noticing something and being able to act on it appropriately required the patient accumulation of evidence that turned instinct into actionable understanding. The revelation of the Augustine Society and its history of vampire experimentation at Whitmore reached back further than any single rogue professor's research agenda, deeper into the college's institutional history, in ways that made the horror of it more comprehensive and more difficult to contain within the category of individual aberration or isolated misconduct. The organization had existed across generations with the sustained purpose of capturing and studying vampires for scientific ends that practitioners across those generations had justified through various frameworks of knowledge and protection. The justifications shifting across eras to accommodate whatever moral vocabulary was currently available, while the fundamental activity remained constant. The treatment of vampires as specimens whose inner life and relational existence were irrelevant beside the scientific information their bodies and behaviors could yield. She understood this framework with a personal and visceral clarity that went beyond intellectual objection. Her own captivity and the experiments performed on her during her time as their prisoner, providing first-hand knowledge of what it felt like to exist inside a system that had entirely evacuated the concept of your personhood from its operating premises. Being held for experimentation activated in Caroline a response that was simultaneously practical and deeply personal, her mind moving through available options and escape strategies with methodical focus, while something beneath that focus registered the specific quality of this violation, its connection to older and larger patterns of people, being institutionalized and managed and studied rather than seen and helped and released. She did not become paralyzed by the personal resonance of what was happening to her. She used it. The fury that the situation generated became fuel for the focused determination to get out, to help Eleanor get out, to dismantle from the outside whatever could be dismantled once outside was achieved, and to ensure that her captivity was the last productive thing the Augustine Society managed to accomplish with whatever time remained to it. Enzo's history with the Augustine Society preceded hers by decades, his captivity having extended across a span of time that made her own imprisonment look brief by comparison. The sustained duration of his captivity having shaped him in ways that were both visible and occasionally alarming. The damage evident in his relationship with violence and in the specific places where his emotional responses had been restructured by prolonged extreme experience into patterns that differed from what they might have been under less catastrophic circumstances. His dark humor was not performance, but genuine orientation. The development of aesthetic distance from horror as survival mechanism across so many years of having no other mechanism available. And Caroline recognized this quality in him the way she recognized most things about people whose survival had required them to develop unusual internal architectures, with the particular understanding of someone who had herself constructed elaborate internal structures in order to keep going through things that should have made keeping going impossible. Their dynamic was neither simple friendship nor simple antagonism, but something in between that refused to resolve into cleaner categories. His capacity for genuine loyalty and her instinct for genuine connection, finding each other across the significant barrier of his willingness to cause harm in ways that her values consistently resisted and rejected. She did not trust him without qualification, and she did not dismiss him without qualification, and she held both assessments simultaneously with the moral seriousness of someone who understood that people were not reducible to their worst qualities or their worst moments, but who also understood that ignoring worst qualities and worst moments in the interest of simpler emotional categories was its own form of failure. The travelers and their ancient campaign against spirit magic introduced a category of threat that was different in its fundamental nature from anything Caroline had encountered previously. Their power collective and their agenda historical in ways that made the usual frameworks for identifying and addressing supernatural threats inadequate from the beginning. They did not want anything from the Cullens or the Salvatores or anyone specific. They wanted Mystic Falls, wanted the town itself as the site for a working of magic whose completion would serve their purposes regardless of what it cost everyone who lived there. Their indifference to individual harm, not cruelty, exactly, but something in certain ways worse than cruelty. The simple subordination of everyone's specific existence to an agenda that had been in motion for centuries before any of them were born. The progressive flooding of Mystic Falls with traveler magic created effects that accumulated gradually and then became impossible to dismiss or work around. The spirit magic that sustained supernatural creatures being actively dismantled by the competing magic the travelers were embedding in the town's geography. The practical consequence for Caroline being that remaining within Mystic Falls became dangerous to her continued existence in ways that had nothing to do with any individual's hostility toward her, and everything to do with the collision of ancient supernatural systems that she had no power to prevent or redirect. The exile from the town was loss of a specific and particularly cruel kind. The geography of her entire identity becoming inhospitable to what she was. The place that contained every significant thing that had ever happened to her, transformed by forces entirely indifferent to that significance, into somewhere she could not safely remain. Stefan's death during this period arrived with the particular devastation of losing someone whose presence in her story had been foundational rather than simply important. The person who had guided her through the most disorienting period of her existence and had remained a consistent and trusted presence across every subsequent complication. His absence creating a gap in the architecture of her daily life that had no equivalent and no easy substitution. She grieved him with the thoroughness that her relationship with grief had developed across repeated practice. Not efficiently or quickly, but genuinely and completely, giving the loss the full weight it deserved, without allowing that weight to become justification for ceasing to function or ceasing to be present for the people around her who were grieving the same loss from their own angles. His return through the collapsing other side carried the complicated relief of something restored that had cost more than the restoration could entirely justify. The joy of having him back threaded through with the knowledge of what Bonnie was enduring, as the anchor through which his passage back had been made possible. Every person who returned through that deteriorating threshold doing so at the expense of Bonnie's continued suffering. The accounting impossible to resolve into anything that felt morally clean, regardless of how necessary the choices that produced it had been. The collapse of the other side and the loss of Damon and Bonnie together in his dissolution was the season's final and most comprehensive blow. The double absence requiring simultaneous grief for two people whose significance to her life was vast and entirely different in character. The oldest friend and the complicated foundational presence both gone in the same catastrophic moment, without the space between their losses that might have allowed for any degree of separate mourning. She stood in what remained, and she continued standing, because continuing to stand was what she did, because the people she had lost deserved to be carried forward by someone who remained alive and remained committed to living fully, because the alternative to continuing was a betrayal of everything they had been to her and everything she had learned from having known them. The world she occupied at the close of this year was smaller than the one she had entered it with, its population reduced by losses that had arrived with exhausting frequency across 12 months, that had asked more of her capacity for grief and resilience, and continued functioning than any previous period of her supernatural existence. She organized around what remained, because organizing around what remained was the only available response that honored both the losses and the living, that refused to treat survival as something separate from the obligation to actually live, rather than simply continue existing in the diminished version of life that sustained grief, unaddressed and unchallenged, tended to produce. She was still Caroline Forbes. The catastrophes had not changed this. They had only made it more visible, more essential, more completely and unmistakably true. The summer after the collapse of the other side had the particular quality of aftermath that arrives when catastrophe has been so comprehensive that ordinary life resumes not because anyone has processed what happened, but because ordinary life does not wait for processing, because the world continues requiring participation, regardless of whether the people being asked to participate feel remotely equipped to offer it. Caroline moved through those months with the functional competence that had always been her most reliable resource in the absence of better options. The lists and the plans and the organized responses to practical problems providing structure, when the interior landscape offered very little that felt stable or navigable or worth the effort of sustained attention. Damon was gone. Bonnie was gone. The other side no longer existed in any form that could be reached or negotiated with or searched for survivors within. These were facts, and she held them with the seriousness they deserved, while also getting up every morning and continuing to exist in a world that had been significantly diminished by their loss. Bonnie's absence registered differently from Damon's in ways that Caroline could not entirely account for through any straightforward logic of grief. The loss of her oldest friend operating at depths that the loss of Damon, significant as it was in its effects on everyone around her, did not reach in quite the same way. The particular quality of a friendship that had been present since childhood and had survived every conceivable test of loyalty and circumstance now simply gone. The other end of a connection that had been among the most defining of her existence, no longer attached to anyone who could feel it. She had lost people before. She had lost her father and Jessie and various others whose absences had each cost her something specific and irreplaceable. Losing Bonnie was different in the way that losing someone who has known you since before you knew yourself is different. The loss including not just the person but all the shared history that only that person had carried alongside you, the memories and the references and the accumulated shorthand of a relationship built across years that no one else could substitute for or replicate. The prison world revealed itself gradually through the efforts of the group to understand what had happened at the moment of the other side's collapse, the existence of a parallel dimension constructed by the Gemini Coven as a prison for their most dangerous member, becoming increasingly apparent as the evidence accumulated and the channels of communication between dimensions were painstakingly identified and exploited. Damon and Bonnie had not been annihilated by the collapse. They had been displaced, transported into a constructed dimension modeled on a specific day in 1994. A world that repeated the same day indefinitely, that was populated by only them and one other, that had been designed as a punishment for the person who had made it necessary, and who was now sharing it with two people who had arrived there by accident rather than by the judgment of any authority with the right to send them. Kai Parker was the other occupant of the prison world, and understanding what Kai Parker was required, setting aside most of the frameworks that Caroline had developed across years of encountering supernatural threats, because those frameworks had been built around people who wanted things and would cause harm in the pursuit of those things, around agendas and ambitions and grievances that could be mapped and predicted and potentially countered. Kai did not operate within any of these frameworks because his relationship to other people's experience was fundamentally different from that of anyone else she had encountered. His absence of empathy, not the cultivated cruelty of someone who had suppressed their capacity for compassion in service of power or self-preservation, but something more elemental, a genuine inability to register other people's suffering as information that required any response beyond the purely intellectual, the pain of others arriving to him as data rather than as reality demanding acknowledgement or amelioration. He was also brilliant, and this combination, the intelligence without the empathy, made him more dangerous than his specific supernatural abilities alone would have made him. His capacity for planning and anticipating and reading situations, operating without the constraints that normal human feeling imposes on the willingness to follow plans to their most harmful conclusions. He was a siphoner, a witch without his own magic, who could drain magic from other sources and use it as his own. His supernatural ability as unsettling in its mechanics as his personality was in its implications, both functioning as forms of extraction that left their sources diminished in the service of his amplification. The months he spent in the prison world with Damon and Bonnie shaped the dynamic between all three of them in ways that each of them carried back into the living world when the prison world was finally breached The experience of sustained proximity to Kai, leaving marks that did not simply resolve upon return to ordinary circumstances. Caroline's role in the effort to bring Damon and Bonnie home was characteristic, thorough and sustained, and fueled by the specific combination of loyalty and organizational determination that made her exceptional at the kinds of long-term efforts that required consistent attention across weeks and months of incremental progress, without clear indication of whether the endpoint would ever actually be reached. She researched and she coordinated and she pushed the effort forward during the periods when others lost momentum or faith, or simply ran out of the emotional energy that sustained hope requires. Her own grief at their absence functioning not as impediment to the work but as fuel for it. The loss channeled into action because action was what Caroline Forbes did with things too large and too painful to simply sit with. Liz Forbes's cancer diagnosis arrived in the middle of all of this, with the particular cruelty of a threat that operated entirely outside the supernatural framework within which Caroline had learned to identify and counter dangers. The illness, ordinary and biological, and therefore immune to every resource she had accumulated across years of navigating extraordinary circumstances. Vampire blood could heal injuries and reverse supernatural damage with reliable efficiency, but it could not touch a cancer that had established itself through entirely natural cellular processes, the one category of threat that her transformation had left her entirely without tools to address, the one situation in which everything she had become offered nothing useful against something that was simply, mundanely, quietly killing her mother. The reversal of their relationship into something closer to Caroline as caretaker happened gradually and then completely. The daughter had spent her childhood navigating the particular loneliness of a mother whose love was consistent and whose presence was frequently directed elsewhere, now present and focused, and available in ways that the younger Caroline had sometimes ached for, and that the current circumstances made both possible and heartbreaking simultaneously. She organized her mother's medical appointments with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, researched every available treatment option across conventional and experimental frameworks, manage the practical dimensions of Liz's declining health with the efficiency that was her most reliable gift, and that served now as the primary expression of a love that she was also finally learning to express in less organized and more simply human ways. The conversations they had during Liz's illness were the conversations that the years of Liz's emotional unavailability and Caroline's performed sufficiency had prevented them from having earlier. The proximity of death creating permission for honesty that ordinary life had not provided. The things finally said that should have been said across years of careful mutual management, arriving now with the urgency and the tenderness of things that could not afford to wait any longer for the right moment, because the supply of right moments was visibly and irreversibly diminishing. Caroline sat with her mother and was present without agenda or performance for perhaps the first time in their relationship, without the need to demonstrate capability or manage impressions or ensure that what Liz saw was the best possible version of her daughter, simply present as herself with all her complications and her grief and her love that had always been enormous and had never quite known how to arrive in forms that her mother's particular kind of distance had been able to receive. Liz Forbes died with her daughter beside her, and the loss was the most significant Caroline had sustained since her own death and transformation. The absence operating at the level of fundamental orientation rather than simply relational grief, the loss of her mother, meaning the loss of the human anchor, the last living direct connection to her human life in its most essential and irreducible form. She grieved with a completeness that she did not try to manage or contain or organize into something more functional than it actually was, allowing herself the full weight of it in ways that her previous losses had not always permitted, given the practical demands of ongoing supernatural crises that had required her continued functional presence regardless of what she was feeling internally. She let herself be devastated because being devastated was appropriate, and because her mother deserved to be properly mourned by someone who had loved her completely. The humanity switch presented itself as option in this context, with a particular seductiveness of relief that arrives when pain has reached a level at which the idea of simply not feeling it becomes genuinely appealing rather than simply abstractly possible. The switch not a cowardly choice, but a comprehensible one. The response of someone whose capacity to absorb loss had been tested across an extended period with a consistency that would have broken most people regardless of supernatural resilience. She turned it off and felt the immediate absence of the grief as something that was both relief and wrongness simultaneously. The quiet that arrived when the feelings stopped being different in character from peace. Flatter and more comprehensive, the world reduced to its surfaces without the depths that her emotional life had always given it. Her behavior without humanity had the cold efficiency of someone freed from the considerations that normally constrain her choices. The Caroline who had always cared too much and felt too much and organized everything around the needs and feelings of the people she loved, now operating without those organizing principles, her intelligence and her capability intact, while the warmth that had always directed their application was simply absent. Stefan was assigned to reach her and bring her back, his patience with her in this state a demonstration of the specific quality of their friendship that endured even when she was actively hostile to his efforts and his continued presence, his refusal to give up on her outlasting her own determination to remain unreachable. The humanity's return arrived through the particular mechanism that her internal architecture required, not argument or emotional appeal, but the direct confrontation with her mother's memory in ways that her suppression could not entirely deflect. The grief breaking through the switch's suppression with the force of something that had been building pressure across weeks of artificial containment. She came back to herself in stages, the feeling returning with the disorienting intensity of sensation after numbness, the grief enormous and present and entirely appropriate, and also, beneath it, the beginning of something else, some new orientation towards Stefan that the weeks of his sustained and patient refusal to abandon her had quietly been constructing while her humanity was absent and unavailable to notice it. Stefan Salvatore had been her friend since the beginning, since the very first days of her transformation, when he had chosen to help her navigate an experience that had been done to her without her consent, and that could easily have destroyed her if she had been left to manage it without guidance or support. That original act of genuine care had established the foundation for everything that followed between them. The friendship deepening across years of shared supernatural navigation into something that was among the most important relationships in her life. A connection built on mutual respect and genuine knowledge of each other that had survived every complication and every period of crisis without losing its essential reliability. The shift from friendship into something more arrived not as sudden transformation, but as gradual recognition of something that had been present in different form for long enough that the transition felt less like beginning and more like acknowledgement. The first kiss happened in circumstances that were emotionally complicated by everything surrounding it, and were also simply honest. Two people who had known each other thoroughly across years of genuine, shared experience, recognizing that what existed between them had developed into something that deserved to be acknowledged rather than managed back into the safer category of friendship. She felt the difference between this and what had come before in ways that she could not immediately articulate, but that registered as meaningful. The recognition of being chosen by someone who knew exactly what he was choosing and had chosen it deliberately rather than by default, or by circumstance, or by the particular gravity of someone whose needs were larger and more visible than her own. Kai's eventual escape from the prison world and his transformation through the Gemini merge into something more powerful and more volatile than he had been before, introduced a new dimension of threat into a period that had already been comprehensively demanding. The merge with his twin Luke changed him in ways that were initially difficult to assess, adding an emotional range he had not previously possessed, while leaving the fundamental architecture of his personality intact, in ways that made the emotional additions unpredictable rather than simply humanizing. The combination of new feeling and established sociopathy producing behavior that was harder to anticipate than pure calculated cruelty had been. His attack on the Gemini Coven and on Alaric and Joe's wedding was the act that defined him finally and completely. The violence arriving at the moment of greatest vulnerability and greatest celebration, with the specific cruelty of someone who understood exactly what he was destroying and destroyed it anyway. Joe's death and the loss of the twin she carried, removing from Alaric everything that his cautious and hard-won happiness had been built around. The devastation comprehensive and deliberate, and without any mitigating justification that could have made it anything except what it was. Caroline absorbed this loss alongside her own, held Alaric's grief alongside her continued grief for her mother and for every other person the year had taken, and kept going because keeping going was the only available form of honor available to the living in relation to everyone they had lost. The heretics arrived in Mystic Falls with a particular combination of ancient power and personal grievance that made them immediately and comprehensively dangerous. Their status as vampire witch hybrids placing them outside the usual categorical frameworks through which the town's supernatural population understood threat and managed response. Their abilities exceeding what either vampires or witches alone could accomplish, and their loyalty to Lily Salvatore creating a political complexity that made simple elimination impossible without consequences that extended well beyond the immediate tactical situation. They were Lily's family, in the way that chosen families are family. The bond between them forged across decades of shared imprisonment in a prison world that had been their punishment for the heresy of siphoning magic from other witches, their devotion to each other and to Lily absolute, in ways that made negotiating with any one of them require accounting for the responses of all of them simultaneously. Lily Salvatore herself was the complication that contained all other complications, her existence requiring everyone who had previously understood the Salvatore family history through the simplified framework of the boy's grief for a mother they believed long dead to entirely reconstruct that understanding around a far more complex reality. She had loved Damon and Stefan in the way that a woman who had been dying of consumption and then transformed into vampire and then imprisoned by the Gemini Coven for over a century could love the children she had left behind, which was to say, with genuine feeling that had been separated from its objects across enough time and enough transformative experience that it no longer quite mapped onto the people her sons had become in her absence. She chose her heretics over her biological sons when the choice was forced, and this choosing was not simple cruelty, but the honest expression of where her deepest bonds actually resided after everything that had occurred, and understanding it as anything other than abandonment required a generosity that Damon in particular found essentially impossible to summon. Caroline navigated the heretic situation with the diplomatic attentiveness that had become one of her most reliable capabilities across years of managing impossible interpersonal situations involving supernatural creatures with grievances and power, and the willingness to use both without much regard for the collateral consequences of their use. She paid attention to each heretic individually, learning their particular motivations and their particular pressure points, and the specific things that mattered to each of them in ways that made engagement possible, even when their behavior made engagement feel inadvisable. Her gift for genuine interest in people she was simultaneously managing serving her particularly well in circumstances where the line between diplomacy and survival was essentially non-existent. She was not simply performing interest in them. She was genuinely curious about what they were and how they had come to be it, and what they wanted from the world, now that the world had been returned to them after decades of enforced absence from it. The negotiation around the occupation of Mystic Falls required the particular combination of firmness and flexibility that Caroline had developed through years of navigating between supernatural factions whose interests were incompatible and whose power made simple resolution impossible. Her ability to hold her position without escalating into confrontation that would produce outcomes worse than the current impasse, being the skill that the situation most demanded, and that she was most equipped to provide. She was the person in the room most likely to find the arrangement that everyone could live with, not because she was the most powerful person present, but because she was the most attentive to what everyone actually needed, as distinct from what they were currently demanding. The gap between those two things being where every negotiated solution lives. The revelation that Caroline was pregnant arrived in the category of impossible things that her supernatural existence had trained her to process without the luxury of extended disbelief. The Gemini Coven's magic having transferred the twins that Joe had been carrying into Caroline as the only available vessel with a supernatural resilience to sustain them. The spell executed by the heretic Valerie without Caroline's knowledge or consent, and then simply existing as fact that required response regardless of how impossible the fact itself was. She was a vampire. Vampires were frozen, unchanging, incapable of the biological processes that pregnancy required. And yet the twins were real and present and growing inside her, with the confirmation of every diagnostic approach available to the supernatural medical knowledge that Alaric and the group could bring to bear on the situation. The impossibility of the fact, insufficient to make the fact less true or less demanding of immediate practical attention. Her characteristic response was immediate and comprehensive. The shock absorbed and the planning commenced with a speed that people who did not understand Caroline sometimes mistook for absence of feeling rather than what it actually was, which was feeling so large and so complex that the only available way to hold it was to immediately begin building the structure that would allow her to carry it forward without being immobilized by it. She researched everything available about supernatural pregnancy, created systems for monitoring the twins' development, established the medical and practical protocols that would govern the remainder of the pregnancy with the same meticulous attention to potential problems and their preemptive solutions that she brought to every significant undertaking. She was terrified and she was overwhelmed, and she was already, beneath both of those things, becoming devoted to these children in ways that she had not anticipated, and that arrived with a completeness and an immediacy that surprised her even as it felt entirely natural. Alaric's role in this unprecedented situation carried its own complexity. His gratitude for the existence of the children genuine, and his grief for Joe, and for the context in which their twins should have arrived undiminished by the gratitude. The two things coexisting with the painful honesty of circumstances that were simultaneously loss and gift, without the one negating or resolving the other. He and Caroline developed across the months of the pregnancy, a partnership that was built on shared investment in specific people rather than on romantic feeling. The co-parenting dynamic emerging organically from the practical requirements of their situation and from the genuine mutual respect that years of existing in the same supernatural community had produced between them. She liked him. She trusted him. She was carrying his children. None of this was romantic and all of it was real, and they built their arrangement around the reality of what they actually had, rather than around the fantasy of what more conventional circumstances might have provided. Lizzie and Josie entered the world with a particular drama that characterized most significant events in Caroline Forbes' existence, their birth attended by supernatural complications that made ordinary obstetric challenges seem straightforward. By comparison, their arrival completing something in Caroline that she had not known was incomplete, answering a question about herself that she had not known she was asking. She had never consciously wanted children, had never included motherhood in the lists she made and the futures she planned, had organized her immortal existence around relationships and loyalties and commitments that did not include this specific form of love, and the love arrived anyway with a comprehensive totality of something that does not require invitation or preparation, that simply is from the first moment of its existence in ways that render all previous conceptions of what mattered and how much insufficient. The names were not accidental. The choice of Lizzie for her mother and Josie for Joe, carrying the deliberate weight of the dead being honored through the living. The name's a declaration that these children will carry forward the people who had not survived to meet them. That loss and continuation were not opposites, but dimensions of the same sustained act of love that Caroline had been practicing across her entire supernatural existence. Every person she had lost was present in some form in how she loved and what she built. The absences not erased by new presence, but integrated into it. The grief and the joy coexisting with the complexity that characterized every significant thing in her life. Stefan's proposal arrived in the context of their relationship having developed across the preceding year into something that felt more solid and more mutual and more genuinely chosen than anything she had previously experienced in the romantic dimension of her existence. The foundation of years of genuine friendship, giving their romantic partnership a depth and a stability that relationships built from attraction alone, rarely achieved, even across much longer durations, chose her with the deliberateness of someone who had looked at every dimension of who she was and what her life contained, the twins and the supernatural complications and the history and the ongoing impossibility of everything, and had decided that all of it was exactly what he wanted, that she specifically and completely was exactly who he wanted to spend his immortal existence beside. She felt the difference between this choosing and previous experiences of being chosen. The absence of the old familiar shadow of being second best or incidental to a larger narrative. The simple, clean experience of being someone's first and deliberate and irreversible choice. She said yes with the certainty of someone who had learned through years of hard experience the difference between feelings that were genuine and feelings that were performed. The certainty, not naive or uninformed but earned, rooted in her thorough knowledge of exactly who Stefan Salvatore was after years of being his friend, through every version of himself that the seasons had required him to be. She knew his darkness and his guilt, and the particular ways that his history complicated his present, and she chose him anyway, with the same full information completeness with which he had chosen her. The engagement representing not the beginning of their story, but the formal acknowledgement of a story that had been developing across years of genuine knowing. The sirens introduced themselves into this period of relative stability and tentative happiness, with a particular efficiency of threats that operate through the most intimate available channels. Sybil and Celine's ability to reach into minds and reshape perceptions and compel behavior, making them dangerous in ways that conventional supernatural strength could not adequately counter. Celine's targeting of Lizzie and Josie was the most direct assault on Caroline's fundamental security that anything had ever managed. The threat to her children activating a dimension of fierceness that she had not previously known she possessed. A protectiveness so total and so absolute that it operated prior to any calculation about consequences or strategy. The simple, overwhelming imperative of keeping her children safe preceding everything else in the hierarchy of what mattered and what she was willing to do. She confronted this threat with a full deployment of every resource she had developed across years of supernatural navigation. The organizational precision and the relational intelligence and the willingness to do whatever was necessary combined in service of protecting two small people who had no capacity to protect themselves and who were hers in the most complete and irreducible sense of that word. The experience of this specific protectiveness clarified something for her about the nature of her own strength, about the source from which it had always drawn, even when she had not understood its origin clearly. The love that had always driven her organizing and her planning, and her relentless showing up now revealed in its most essential form as the engine behind everything else. The thing that had always been the actual center of the entire operation. Damon's repeated cycling through humanity and its absence created ongoing complications for the group that Caroline navigated with the weary expertise of someone who had watched this particular pattern play out enough times to understand both its predictability and its genuine danger. His humanity off versions consistently capable of harm that his humanity on self would spend significant time and energy regretting and attempting to repair. Stefan's efforts to reach his brother required his consistent attention and energy in ways that created tension in his relationship with Caroline, not through any failure of love or commitment on either side, but through the simple mathematics of attention. The claim his brother's crises made on him, sometimes arriving in conflict with the claims of the life he was building with her and their daughters. She managed this tension with the maturity of someone who had learned through years of experience the difference between a relationship being imperfect and a relationship being wrong. Understanding that the complications Stefan's family loyalty created were not evidence of insufficient love for her, but evidence of the kind of person he was. Someone whose loyalty extended to people who made that loyalty difficult. Someone who did not abandon the people he loved when they became inconvenient or damaging, or less than their best selves. She valued this quality in him even when its expression was costly, because it was exactly the quality that she had always relied on in their friendship. The refusal to give up on people that had characterized his relationship with her from the very first days of her transformation, and that she had no moral standing to resent when it expressed itself in relation to someone other than herself. The Salvatore School for the Young and Gifted began as Alaric's vision and became Caroline's project in the particular way that things become hers, completely and with the full force of her organizational capability and her passionate investment. The concept of a school designed to give supernatural children the guidance and community and sense of belonging that she had never had as a new vampire arriving in her awareness as something that needed to exist with the immediacy of an obvious truth that has somehow remained unstated too long. She had been 17 years old and terrified and entirely without context for what she had become, had navigated the first months of her supernatural existence without any institution designed to help her do so, with less damage and less fear and less isolation. And the school was in part the answer she was building retroactively for the girl she had been, the resource she was creating for every supernatural child who would come after her and who deserved better than to figure it out alone. She threw herself into the school's development with the comprehensive dedication that was her signature, working through every practical and logistical dimension of establishing an institution that served a student population whose needs were genuinely unprecedented, whose curriculum required the integration of supernatural education into conventional academic frameworks, whose pastoral care demanded staff with the specific combination of knowledge and compassion that was not exactly widely available for recruitment. She was exceptional at this work in ways that reflected every dimension of what she had become across the years. The organizational precision and the genuine investment in individual students, and the understanding of what it actually felt like to be supernatural and young and frightened, and in need of someone who could help you become capable rather than simply dangerous. Stefan Salvatore took the cure and became human in the series finale with the particular quality of a choice that was simultaneously surprising and entirely consistent with who he had always been at his most essential level. Someone whose relationship with his own vampire existence had never achieved the peace that Carlyle Cullen's kind of moral certainty might have provided. Someone who had always understood himself as someone who had been changed, rather than someone who had arrived at what he was supposed to be. His humanity was the thing he had always been trying to return to across the decades of his immortal existence. The cure, not a defeat, but a completion. The restoration of something he had lost and had spent a century and a half quietly mourning, even through the periods when he had managed to build genuine meaning and genuine connection within his supernatural existence. His death as a human, sacrificing the brief human life the cure had given him to stop Kai and protect the people he loved, arrived with the terrible completeness of something that could not be undone or organized around or managed through sufficient planning. The loss absolute in ways that Caroline's years of developing resilience had prepared her to survive, but had not and could not have made anything other than devastating. She received his final letter with the full weight of everything it contained, his acknowledgement of what she had meant to him, and his trust that she would continue and build something worthy of the love they had shared, arriving as both comfort and unbearable confirmation of absence. The tenderness of it real and the loss of it real, and both things simultaneously true in the way that love and grief are always simultaneously true. She built the school and raised her daughters and carried everyone she had lost in the way she had always carried loss, forward rather than under, integrated into her continued existence as dimension of who she was, rather than weight that prevented her from being it. The girl who had been told her whole life that she was not quite the main character of the story she was living had built an institution that would outlast every temporary crisis and every individual threat, and every moment when the world had tried to convince her that her particular combination of fierce love and relentless organization and absolute refusal to give up on people who needed her was somehow too much, was somehow excessive or exhausting or more than circumstances required. It had never been too much. It had always been exactly enough. It had always been, in fact, the most essential thing about her, the quality from which everything else she had ever accomplished or survived or created had ultimately derived its possibility. Caroline Forbes had spent her human life trying to earn her place in a story that she did not understand she was already the center of, and her immortal life demonstrating with comprehensive and irrefutable evidence that the center had always been hers, that it had simply been waiting for her to claim it, with the full confidence of someone who finally understood that she had always already deserved to be exactly where she was. And so Caroline Forbes continues forward into a future that she is already planning, already organizing, already building with the same comprehensive devotion that has characterized every significant thing she has ever undertaken. Her immortal life stretching ahead of her with the particular quality of open possibility that belongs to someone who has survived everything the world has sent against her and emerged from each survival not diminished, but deepened, not broken, but more completely and more irrefutably herself than she was before the breaking was attempted. She began as the girl in Mystic Falls who kept the lists and ran the committees and stood slightly to the side of the story she was living, certain in ways she could not quite articulate and could not quite escape that the narrative center belonged to someone else, that her role was to support and organize and show up and be excellent in all the ways that excellence is possible for someone who is not quite the one the story is about. She was wrong about this, as the people who told her she was not enough were wrong, as every circumstance that tried to confirm her insufficiency was wrong. The error so comprehensive and so consistent that correcting it required nothing less than the entirety of everything that followed. She was Catherine Pierce's disposable piece on a board she did not yet know existed, and she became a vampire who chose her values before she fully understood that choosing values was something vampires were permitted to do. She was Damon Salvatore's convenient distraction, used and compelled and returned to when useful, and she became someone whose understanding of what it meant to have one's will overridden by another's power informed every subsequent choice she made about how she would and would not use the abilities her transformation had given her. She was the girl who loved too much and organized too aggressively and cared with an intensity that the people around her sometimes found exhausting. And she became the woman who built a school specifically because loving too much and organizing too aggressively and caring with inexhaustible intensity turned out to be exactly what supernatural children without guidance or community or any framework for understanding what they were most desperately needed from an adult in their lives. Her losses were real and they were numerous, and they were never minimized or resolved into something easier to carry than what they actually were. Her father, who loved her and could not fully accept what she was and died before they finished the work of understanding each other across that gap. Her mother, who was competent and dutiful and present in every way, except the ways that young Caroline had most needed her to be, and who became, in the proximity of her dying, something closer to the mother that both of them had always wanted their relationship to contain. Stefan, who had been her first guide and her sustained friend and her chosen partner, and who died as human in an act of sacrifice so consistent with everything he had always been at his most essential that the loss and the love were impossible to separate from each other. The grief and the recognition arriving together and inseparable. Bonnie, lost and found and lost again across years of a friendship that had been one of the fixed stars of her existence. The connection between them, among the most durable things in a world that had proved itself capable of dismantling almost everything. She carried all of them forward in the only way the living can carry the dead, through the continued insistence on living fully and building carefully and loving with the totality that she had brought to every relationship she had ever chosen to invest in. The absences present in everything she constructed, rather than absent from it, the people she had lost woven into the institution, and the daughters and the daily practice of being Caroline Forbes in whatever circumstances the current moment required. The Salvatore School stood as the most visible evidence of what she had made from everything she had been given and everything she had survived, its existence the answer to every moment when the world had suggested that her particular combination of gifts was somehow too much, or too focused on the wrong things or excessive in ways that required apology or moderation. She had taken the excessive love and the relentless organization, and the fierce protectiveness, and the absolute refusal to give up on people who needed someone to refuse to give up on them. And she had built something institutional from it, something that would continue after her, and that will provide for generations of supernatural children. The thing that she had most needed and most lacked in her own first terrifying months of supernatural existence. She was vampire and mother and founder and friend and partner and survivor, and the woman who showed up to every impossible situation with more preparation and more love and more fierce commitment than the situation had any reasonable right to expect. And she was all of these things simultaneously without any of them negating or diminishing any of the others. The multiplicity of her identity is not contradiction, but richness. Not excessive, but exactly sufficient for the life she was living and the world she was building inside it. So rest now, gentle dreamers, and carry with you into the quiet of sleep something of Caroline Forbes's particular brand of fierce and organized and absolutely inexhaustible love. Her reminder that being told you exist at the margins of your own story is not evidence that this is true, but evidence only that the people doing the telling have not yet understood what they are looking at. That the ones who show up and plan and love and refuse to stop showing up are not supporting the story, but are in so many of the ways that matter most actually the story itself, the center around which everything else organizes and holds. Let her remind you that transformation does not erase who you are. It reveals who you always were. Let the certainty of that carry you softly, gently, completely into rest. Good night.